Welcome to the Writers League of Texas podcast, conversations and presentations featuring writers and industry professionals talking about the craft and business of writing. More information about this discussion, including details on our panelists and presenters, can be found at writersleague.org. We hope you enjoy the discussion.
This is Third Thursday, and tonight's topic is, and I'm very proud of this title, Mr. Swipe Right, Writing Contemporary Love Stories. Our panelists tonight are, starting with my left, Liana LeFey is the author of 7 romance novels, including the A Scandal in London series. Her books are set in wildly different places and times, including Georgian London and fantasy and science fiction worlds. Her most recent novel is Scandal of the Season, which comes out next week. She lives in Central Texas with her husband, daughter, and 1 cat. Please welcome Liana.
Thank you.
Clara Bensen's first book, No Baggage, a travel memoir, was based on a 2013 Salon.com article entitled The Craziest OkCupid Date Ever. It was read by more than 500,000 people. The story of her luggage-less adventure attracted major national and international attention and has been translated into a dozen languages. She's currently breaking ground on a series of wild social experiments that play with the intersection between madness and society. Please welcome Clara. Benjamin reads fiction, is widely published in journals. He won the 2016 Texas Observer Short Story Contest, the 2013 Austin Chronicle Short Story Contest, and the second annual Avery Anthology Small Spaces Prize. He's a graduate of the University of Texas and holds an MFA from Texas State University, where he teaches writing and literature. He lives in Austin with his family and is currently at work on both a novel and a story collection. Please welcome Ben. And Paige Schilt is a writer, mother, teacher, activist, and bandwife. Her stories have appeared on the Bilerico Project, Offbeat Families, Mother Magazine, and Brainchild. She is a frequent speaker and facilitator at conferences, including Gender Odyssey, Contemporary Relationships, Creating Change, and Texas Transgender Non-Discrimination Summit. Kirkus Review named her memoir, Queer Rock Love, one of the top 10 indie memoirs of 2016. Wow. Please welcome Paige. So we're talking about love stories tonight, and I thought I would start with a kind of softball, but it does make me sort of wonder, sort of like the premise of tonight's topic, which is like, why love stories? Like it's one of the oldest genres there is, and it sells a ton. And we tell love stories and we watch them constantly. But it's not like it's the only thing going on in our lives, right? We also love eating and sleeping and riding roller coasters and calling our representatives and all the things, right, that we spend a lot of time doing. But what is the appeal of love stories? What sort of draws us back to them again and again? And I guess I'll turn this one over to the romance novelist. Liana, what do you think?
One of the things about being human is our existence is defined by relationships. You hear about people that are hermits that go off and they live by themselves, but the majority of people have relationships of varying kinds and degrees with other people. And one of the most sought after relationships is that of a mate. And so, it's hormonally driven, it's psychologically driven. We're brought up to look for love. And I think it's an instinct also. They have proven scientifically that a baby that is not touched will fail to thrive. People seek out other people because it's hardwired into us. So, it stands to reason that it would be a main topic of discussion, of fantasy. It's something that everybody desires in some form or fashion.
Too, we're talking about contemporary love stories, and we're going to not just talk about contemporary love stories, but the idea of a contemporary love story, or the New York Times Magazine column called Modern Love, suggests that there is something different about modern love than love back in the day. Is that the case? The fact that love stories have been around for so long, we tell them over and over, but and when you fall in love, you always think it's nobody's ever done it before. You're I invented that. That was pretty good. Is there something that's fundamentally different about how we enter relationships, think of relationships, marriage, and so on, and love now that sort of informs our stories? Is there something new and interesting about modern love?
I think there's probably many answers to that question, but I'll throw out changing notions of gender and sexual orientation and the way those two things are kind of imbricated. So I have a son who's a middle schooler, and I'd say about half the middle school girls I know identify as pansexual. So I feel like in a world where people's notions of gender is no longer binary, there's so much change to like kind of the possibilities of attraction as well. And certainly the New York Times loves a story about gender. So, I mean, I think that's one piece of the mix, is that maybe we're not just thinking about binary gender, and maybe we're not just thinking about two-person relationships in modern love.
You know, even if you think about like the sort of like standard way that we talk about love stories, boy meets girl, girl does something, you know, they get married, like that sort of is thrown out by what you just described, right? Like does the fact that like we're not talking about like, you know, binary gender in relationships, does that change the kind of stories that we tell, the shape those stories take?
I don't know. I mean, I think the book that comes to mind right now is Ariel Schrag's book Adam, which came out I think maybe 2 years ago, which is about a cisgender man who falls in love with a queer woman and so pretends to be trans so that he can get the girl. And that's it's a boy meets girl kind of plot, but it's also not. So I think it opens up plot possibilities. But I mean, I think just to get back to your first question, one of the things that makes love stories satisfying is that they have a resolution at the end often. I mean, not always, but they can have a lot of social contradictions and have a kind of fantasy happy ending. And I think we need happy endings.
I want to come back to endings in just a second because it's kind of an important part of love stories. But so on this idea of like what is modern about modern love, you know, Clara, your book is based on an article that was posted online about OkCupid. I mean, so none of those statements would have been possible, you know, 30 years ago. What difference does that make in terms of how we tell the story and how we conceive of like dating and, you know, what catches somebody's eye and how we catch their eye, and everything about your date is something that, you know, probably most people don't do, but also might not have even been possible. Did you think that you were like telling a different kind of story? What you might do is, you know, tell people a bit about what the story is.
Sure. So the basic premise of my story, No Baggage, is that I joined an online dating site back in 2013. And then within about a week, I met a guy on there, and we set off on this very kind of risky adventure from Istanbul to London. And the catch was we hardly knew each other, and we only got on the plane with what we were wearing as this sort of social experiment. And the idea was we were going to figure out real quick if we liked each other or hated each other, or, you know, how it was going to unfold. We didn't know. But yeah, the fact that we met online through an app, I think, signifies a shift in modern dating for sure. I think the way we think about relationships is different, but then there are also elements that are kind of the same that run throughout human history. And so I think the theme that I explored in my book was sort of the millennial perspective on modern love and dating. And the words that came up a lot for me were chill and non-committal and keep your options open, because you have so many options now and you can see them all laid out in front of you in a way that people in the past could not. So it creates a lot of dilemmas and questions. And to your point, I think I've read every article on the internet on open relationships, you know, because, you know, people are living longer than ever. And it's like the idea of getting married in your 20s and staying with that person until the end of your life and expecting them to meet all of your emotional, physical, spiritual needs in this modern age. I mean, maybe, but maybe not.
You know, everything you just described, or so much of it, like, you know, the chill and the non-committal and like there's so many options is sort of the classic setup of like romantic comedies. Mm-hmm. Like one of the characters feels that way, and then over the course of the story, they leave that behind and they become like part of like a monogamous, like usually traditional sort of marriage. Did you find yourself pushing back against that at all as you wrote the book, or thought of like the shape that the book would take?
Yeah, so my case is a little bit interesting in that I was writing the book as the story I was writing about was still actively unfolding. So a lot of the questions I'm wrestling with about relationships, I'm actively dealing with in real time. And so that created some tension that in some ways I think comes through the book subconsciously. But yeah, so one of the tensions that I dealt with was this idea of myself as a modern woman who didn't need commitment, who didn't need attachment, and could just live moment to moment, whatever might come. And the tension I experienced was that wasn't totally true. And that part of me did want that frank communication and real commitment to something, you know? I wanted structure. And so the idea of what a modern woman in a relationship should be versus what I was actually feeling, that was complicated.
Ben, in an interview somewhere, you wrote or you said that so many stories, and a lot of yours, are about relationships and transition. You know, and in love stories, you would think the transition would be, you know, getting deeper into the relationship, growing the relationship. But you're shaking your head because that's not how all of our relationships in real life go. And so I wonder how you think about that as you write, you know, a love story or otherwise.
It's funny because I don't think I do it intentionally. Like I don't think about like, okay, this story needs a love interest. And I'm a little cynical, I think, about language about love. It seems to be like very hollow to me. Like people say, you know, I'm sorry for your loss, or you're in our prayers. It seems to be like a kind of a hollow thing to like much of the way we talk about love conventionally. I don't mean on the page. But it just kind of works out to where people have relationships in my stories. And I think one of the ideas that I'm really into is, besides suffering, which I'm really attracted to, I really am. And part of that, let me digress just for a second. I teach literature to people who don't want to be studying literature. And so I try to pick the best books that I can teach them. And one of them is Notes from Underground, which is a catastrophic love story, part of it. But one of the things one of his theses is people would rather suffer and have that be evidence of their freedom than be happy without making the choice that got them to their happiness. And so I kind of like, to get back to your actual question, I think what I'm focused on is like lost, sensations of lost things. What tends to happen, I think, that I like to do in stories is to think about my sense of loss or something that I feel that I've lost, a lost opportunity or a lost person, and kind of bring that back and bring that person back and like reanimate their corpse and bring it into my story, and not literally, but sometimes, and then make them lose it again, and to kind of like rehash that suffering for myself, and I find that very pleasing. It sounds really counterintuitive now that I say it out loud, but it is cathartic. It's masochistic a little bit, but I think that if you're writing about two people or more than two people in a relationship or a triangular relationship or any kind of crossfire relationship, if you don't feel something that they're ostensibly feeling, then you probably might want to like go back to where you were still feeling stuff and work from that point.
You have to have sympathy and empathy with your characters. One of the things that I do personally, and I know a lot of romance writers do, we really do dig deep into our own past and our own experiences, and even some of those that are from people that are close to us, and those all end up getting funneled into the characters. And if you don't dig deep emotionally, your characters are going to come out flat. You have to empathize with them. Even the bad guys, you have to empathize with them. Because everybody knows that no villain thinks that he's a villain or she's a villain. They think that they're the hero of their own story. And you have to find ways to empathize even with those characters that you know are either going to die a horrible death or who aren't going to get their happily ever after. I mean, you have to dig deep when you're going to write those kind of characters if you want it to have any kind of depth on the page for the reader. And so we torture ourselves, we torture our characters. It is a very masochistic profession, writing. I believe it is.
You've got a line, Liana, on your website about like your books and the kinds of like characters that you write about, and you say, but what if the enemy turns out to be your soulmate? What if instead of overcoming the darkness, you submit to its seductive call? That's great conflict, right? But it's also like, that seems given that you're writing a romance novel, it seems like that might not work out very well. Like, how do you wrap a story like that would seem to like be such a terrible idea for the characters involved, right? How does that get them to like the kind of ending that romance novels tend to have? Is that just the magic of the book, or?
No, there's no fairy that comes and delivers those those sorts of things to us. When you write a character, typically before I start writing a book, I will do my character sheets. I do an Enneagram. I will do the GMC. I figure out who that person is, and then I have to figure out who their perfect match is going to be. And if it's somebody that has a darkness in them, like in Once a Courtesan, which is my most recent one, my character, Jacqueline, had a very, very dark past. She could not be with somebody that was all sunshine and rainbows. That just wasn't possible for her. She needed somebody that had a darkness within himself in order to understand her. Because I think that when you write about love, and when we experience it in real life out here in the world, when you have a mate, a potential mate, they need to be able to understand you and where you come from. They have to be able to empathize with you. And I feel like my characters, my hero and my heroine, have to have that as well.
Ben, that makes me think of your story, King of the Apes, which is about Tarzan and Jane. And Tarzan obviously loves Jane very much, but it's unrequited love. She does not feel the same way about him. And that seems to be sort of the flip side of what Liana might be talking about, which is like, here's your perfect person, but wah-wah, like
Wah,
you're
wah.
not theirs.
That kind of goes back to my lost thing. I'll keep this vague because this is being recorded, but it was about Tarzan and Jane, but it was absolutely about a relationship that I had been in, and the relationship was tonally and textually just one way, and then one of us moved, and there was a period of separation and long distance, and then we moved back together, and it was like it was totally different. Everything was whatever was there previously was gone, and it wasn't anybody's fault. Just young people change pretty quickly, but there was like, I don't know. There was the first time in my life where I felt like intense sadness about a relationship. Like I'd had breakups, like everybody else, but it actually was really affecting. And so that story was a way to kind of exercise that.
This is. Can I just say?
Yeah.
I feel excited because I was trying to get prepared for today, so I just started trying to list love stories that I like and can talk about, and I realized it's all unrequited love for me. Like that's where my kind of readerly energy is that loss and that pining, I feel like is really pleasurable.
But you also spoke about wanting happy endings too. How do you get both of those things?
I was talking about people in general who want happy endings. I want unrequited love.
Gotcha.
I hate it when writers talk about films to make analogies for writing because it's just my pet peeve, but I'm going to do it because it just jumped into my head. The ending of The Third Man, when she's walking out of the cemetery, and the guy's leaning up against the car, waiting for her to like come speak to him, and she just walks by him without even looking at him. Like that is a final rejection. Like anything he thought was going to happen between the two of them is obviously in his mind, and she's leaving forever. But there's still this wistful kind of happiness, that kind of happy suffering at the end of the movie. Same as Casablanca is probably a better example because more of us have probably seen that, but. I think Third Man is better.
Well, along those lines of like both happy suffering and unrequited love, I mean, Paige, your memoir is not about unrequited love. It's about falling in love and getting what you want, and then things get hard. And I wonder how you thought about like the shape that this love story would take, because we think about love stories, we think about people meet, and then they go through some strife, and are they really meant for each other, and so on. And then like Shakespeare ends in weddings, right? So like then there's a wedding. But like the wedding for you is pretty early on in the story. So how did you know what your ending was going to be once you get past that kind of like traditional marker?
It's interesting that you brought up the Shakespeare ending with a wedding thing, because that was in my mind. That idea of like a comedy, a story that ends with a love match. It can be a very conservative genre in this way because there's all this social strife, star-crossed lovers, cultural conflict, but then it gets resolved by people getting married at the end. And I felt like for me, especially as a queer writer, I didn't want to kind of be writing about a social world and then have it be like, oh, in the end, we got married and inequality was over. So I actually really, writing the romance part was pleasurable for me. But I was very afraid to write that part because I didn't want it to be, I wanted the book to not have the love plot kind of resolve all these social contradictions. And so, I had to write, it's a memoir, so they're all true, but I also had to kind of write all these characters who were objecting to gay marriage to kind of put my own discomfort in the book as well. But, one of my fears was that often we think about coupling or marriage as kind of a pulling away from the social world. And for me, I wanted to make sure that I was showing a marriage and to people who built a family and stayed socially engaged. And so it had to be about community. It couldn't just be about a couple.
One of the things that you had talked about with the unrequited love, I can tell you, this book, I had 2 side characters, and both of them ended up turning into books of their own because readers could not stand that they did not have their happy ending. There was an unrequited love in this book, and they were like, we have to know, I want his happy ever after. I had a lot of people actually write to me, contact me, and tell me, I want to know what happens to him. And so I was like, okay, and I ended up writing his story, and then somebody else said, well, I want to know what happens to her then. And so I ended up writing another one, and it finally, once everybody had a happy ending, everybody's happy, and I'm not getting any more of those kind of letters. But I was surprised at how many people just would not be willing to leave that loose end. I don't know what it is that they want that completion. They want the circle closed at the end. And I don't think that it's everybody. Like I said, you like tragedy. There are other people that like tragedy. I don't, because I've had enough of it in my personal life to not want to write about it. But I think that there are definite segments of the population that like either or, but some cannot stand to have that piece unfinished. They won't let it be. I don't know how to explain it other than that.
I think my argument is I think they're happier before that itch gets scratched. Like when you leave that open and you leave that circle broken and before you close it, I think yes, on a literal level they want the circle to be closed, but before you do, there's that sweet, there's that pleasurable moment when they're like, they just want it. Mm-hmm. And it's like, when I talk to writing students, I always tell them what happens to the Cubs fan the day after they win the World Series? You've lost your you've lost meaning. You've lost your reason for living because now you've won. That's it. You're there.
In the chase,
now you have to go talk to your long lost daughter or something. You can't live that life anymore.
Ben, you should go write on the back of romance novels. Now these characters have you've lost their meaning. You got what you wanted. It's all over for you now.
The last book I teach every semester now is The Stranger. I break chronology because I'm better at teaching that than I am at the other books, and so I like to finish strong. But there's this one scene. If you haven't read it, I love it. It's a young man's book. I don't know if that's true or not. It was true for me when I was young. But there's this scene where the protagonist has been arrested, and he's basically confesses to his atheism and indifference to the entire theater of prosecution around him, and the magistrate holds a crucifix over his head and says, "You don't believe in God?" And he's like, "I refuse to believe it." And he's like, "I'm sorry." And he goes, "Do you want my life to be meaningless?" And I think which correlates to, if you've read it, Salamano's dog in the beginning, what do I do now? I don't have a dog anymore. I think that book is great because, Camus' writing in high contrast. He's writing a very allegorical story about what happens to people who lean on things without realizing that they're leaning on things. And then you kind of pull that table out from them, whether it's their wife or their dog or their religion. And people it's almost sadistic to watch people. It's existential crisis, essentially, is what they're dealing with, which is something you can do with your characters, with your relationships.
I want to talk about setting because I think it's important in every story, obviously. If your story is sitting in a vacuum, then it's doing something wrong. But it seems like particularly in romance and in love stories, it's awfully important. And I thought, Clara, I'd start with you because tonight when I went looking for your book, it wasn't in memoir, it was in travel memoir.
Oh, really? Okay.
And it's as much as it's a story about like dating, it's a story about travel, and a particular kind of travel because you travel in a particular kind of way. But that in itself is a kind of genre, like the travel love story. I mean, Elizabeth Gilbert didn't set her book Eat, Pray, Love like in her living room, right? I mean, she went off to these sort of exotic locales. And I wonder, like, is there something about travel that is in itself kind of like inherently romantic? And did you think about other similar kinds of stories as you lived and wrote your own?
Yeah, so Elizabeth Gilbert was very much in my mind for both positive and negative reasons as I was writing this story. I think not to talk about film, but Before Sunset and Sunrise, there's a trilogy of movies that also takes place, very compressed amount of time, and people are having this relationship unfold. Yeah, I think travel can be romantic. I think it can also strip away any kind of pretense you have, which in my story, it definitely happened. While you're traveling and you're landing in a city where you have no plans and no place to stay, you're very real. You're your most real version of yourself in some ways. You can't hide your stress or your exhaustion or the fact that you can't read any of the signs. And you have to either work together or not work together. I think it's very revealing. And I have very close friends who I've traveled with, and we love each other dearly, but we're not good travel partners. And so I think it's a really fast way to get to know the reality of who someone is to throw yourself into this unfamiliar situation. And travel is one way to do that.
Well, not only did you travel, but you took nothing. I mean, that was sort of like the no baggage, right? You took nothing with you. You showed up to these various places like with no backpacks and no suitcases, no extra clothes.
Intimacy on a different level. Right. Yeah.
Did that function in kind of a similar way as a travel where you said like it would sort of strip you away so that you're like your truest self? Certain kinds of love stories are very much about like trappings, right? The trappings of particular places, the trappings of love. By stripping away those trappings, did that change the relationship and the experience of dating?
Definitely. I mean, it was like hitting fast forward on the relationship. We were sweaty and disgusting, and in our one pair of clothes, we smelled each other in ways that you would say for months down the road in a traditional relationship. And we discovered that it just didn't really matter, and we really enjoyed each other's company, and we were a good team, and it could have ended very badly, and I don't romanticize that. We had a backup plan that if we discovered that we didn't like the smell of each other, that we would go our separate ways and have our own solo adventures. So there was definitely we were conscious of what we were doing and the fact that it was likely to not work and to end in suffering, as you would hope.
Liana, you write, you set your novels in a variety of places, but one of them is in Georgian London. Mm-hmm. And I mean, not only is that a particular place and time, it's also a kind of subgenre of romance. It is. And what about that particular time and place draws you as a writer and has drawn other writers and readers? Like, why has that become a kind of subgenre?
For one thing, the early Georgian is a lot different than the Regency. Regency, people were much more prim and proper. There were still rules. However, in Georgian England, it was before a lot of the prudery that went on. You might think that some things didn't happen in Georgian England that absolutely happened. There were different types of relationships. Homosexuality did happen. They just didn't talk about it to the wrong people because then they would risk their lives. I mean, you could be killed for that. However, it did happen. It was rampant. As a matter of fact, I've got a manuscript that I'm working on now that has a character that is being assisted by a woman to help him front so that he does not incur that kind of religious wrath and end up getting himself in trouble. And so there's another one of those triangular relationships where, she's covering for him and he's with somebody else, but then she falls in love with somebody else and it's, what are we going to do now? Torture them. you got to make the characters suffer. There has to be a risk. There has to be a stake. But the setting doesn't necessarily impact the relationships so much. You're still writing the same relationships. The same tropes still apply no matter where you set them. Different things will impact how those play out. If you're writing something that's set far in the future with starships and aliens, there are other social factors that are going to come into that. The travel is going to be different. It's not at the same speeds, obviously. When you're writing a romance that's set in a time period where the fastest way of travel is by horse and carriage, you get periods of time where they're going to be able to talk to each other. When you're, warping it, past light speed, you don't necessarily get those times, so you have to build it in a little differently. The relationships happen at a different pace, but they still happen. And again, the same tropes apply no matter where you put them in time.
You mentioned too the word rules, that there were certain kinds of rules that people had to sort of like behave by or play by in Georgia and London. And Clara, you sort of created your rules for this trip. Like you're going to travel in this way and following these sort of like guidelines. And Paige, you mentioned that like you were writing these people into your memoir. They were saying, we don't like that. So you're creating a kind of like rule to push back against. And Ben, in the Tarzan story, like you're playing by some other writer's rules to some extent. Like these are characters you've inherited, and so you have to kind of like you have to stay within the parameters that have been set. How important are those rules to like creating conflict and tension? Of course, like if somebody's going to get like hurt because they don't follow the rules, that's one way.
Yeah, but rules are meant to be bent, if not broken. That's part of the fun of writing a story like that. You tiptoe around some of those rules in order to get what you want. That happens a lot, especially in historical romance, because the risks were so high. You lose your reputation. That was everything. You were out on the street. But again, they would find ways to get around it, and that makes for interesting writing. We take literary license with a lot of those rules, but it makes it fun. It makes it fun to break the rules, and I think that they can be broken no matter what genre you're in. I think it's easier to do it when you have a book that's set in the past, because they were so stringent about some things. When you're writing about the future, of course, the future hasn't been written yet, so you can make those up. You have a lot more leeway. And now, of course, the rules are very different than they were back then. But still, like you were saying, Paige, there are still the people that will shake their finger. They're always going to have that. You're always going to have somebody that's going to object on some level, somewhere. That's universal, I think.
You kind of have to have that for narrative tension. I mean, part of the tension in my book is that, my wife and I got married on our first date. And, like throughout, I'm trying to kind of dangle, like I want to play with the reader's own disapproval and their sense that like this is doomed to fail, like this is bad news. And so, even like for me, Jane Eyre is like the archetypal like love story. Like, Jane, you don't want, like the rule is she needs to not get together with her boss, but you're like, no, please get together with your boss. So, I mean, I feel like those rules they're kind of the engine of narrative tension and suspense.
I once heard somebody say that modern love stories are harder to write because they lack some of the rules or the social mores that existed in the past. And this person went so far as to claim you can't really write a love story now, which clearly not true. But I wonder if you think that's true. If there are fewer rules, or if you just have to sort of look harder for them.
I think it's hard. I mean, we may not experience them as rules, but there's conventions of what it means to have a relationship and what romance is, and we're kind of bombarded with these images of romantic love as a kind of ideal from, pretty much our earliest moments that we're experiencing pop culture. So I think there's a lot of rules in that sense, just in terms of norms of what a relationship is, and what it means to become an adult, things like that.
Even in terms of norms, I remember when I was teaching college students, they'd like to tell me that if they sent a text and they didn't get a reply within a very short amount of time, usually the time that they were sitting in class, that was considered bad form. And I can only imagine what that would do to dating, because I was dating sort of pre-text primarily, and that would make things very stressful.
That's a pressure. I cannot imagine being under that kind of pressure to respond instantly. The connectivity, I guess, that we have nowadays is, I mean, not something that I grew up with either, dating myself, but, you know, I can't imagine the pressure that must put on young people now to feel that, like, oh, I have to respond. You have to stay in constant contact. I wonder what that actually does to a relationship, to have to stay in constant contact like that.
Clara, you met on an app.
Yeah.
You chime in?
I'm like a first or second generation online dating app, and the app that I met on is already no longer like the coolest thing, and that was 4 years ago. But I think it does introduce this whole new set of risks. So in this arena of non-committal, chill, it's fine, I'm cool with you, don't really care, maybe, saying like, I actually do really like you, and I actually do want to try this, and let's do it. That is a new form of risk in this sort of modern era that I think is really interesting, is being bold and straightforward about what you want with all this choice surrounding you, like saying, actually, yeah, let's try this.
A young writer I like a lot, her name is Erica Anderson, and she lives in Brooklyn, and she was in the news. She's in the news currently today, because last weekend she married herself, and which is not probably a fraction of you. It's not the first time you've heard of that. It wasn't the first time I'd heard of it. A friend of a friend in Austin, maybe a decade ago, married herself, registered at like Target or something, and married herself, and you know, obviously it's not it's not what you would call matrimony in a conventional sense, and it's bizarre. And like Rush Limbaugh picked up Erica's story and like had a good laugh about it, and I didn't tune in, but I read the transcript, just so my mom and I could have something to talk about. I'm not even joking. And but there's something like bizarre and like crazy in 2017 or 2000 post, you know, something very post 9/11 about marrying yourself. But at the same time, there's also, you know, the 100,000-year-old problem of how do you live with yourself, and how do you perform self-acceptance, you know, if you can't actually achieve it, or do you fake it till you make it? Like, is anybody really happy with themselves? If it, you know, at some point, I don't know. I feel suckered into this belief that you know, I'm working towards like being okay with me. You know, it's like it's such a cliche too, and it's baloney. It's baloney. It's happening right now. You know, you shouldn't try and like work toward a goal. But how we understand ourselves ends up informing how we treat the people we care about, or the people we believe we care about. And so there is something kind of ancient about marrying yourself, even though it seems completely newfangled.
Buscas. That's a phrase a friend of mine taught me. Como vivas, buscas. You live as you judge, or you judge as you live. You're looking at everyone through the lens of your own experience. It colors everything, and you see in other people. You project what is inside yourself onto other people, even if it's not really there. So I totally get that. The marrying of self, I'm not quite sure about. Now, the bit about the constant communication, I thought about this. I have characters in a science fiction that are telepathically linked. That is constant communication, and I totally forgot about that. But you can write a romance with that. You can. But there has to be areas of unknowns. It can't be, you can't totally know. I know everybody is like, oh, the you know, like in Twilight, you know, I want, you know, somebody that understands me, that, you know, what they don't want to do is make the effort to be understood. They just want somebody to instantly understand. That's the appeal of the telepathy romance thing. Everybody wants to be accepted. Like you said, they're looking for acceptance. Whether it's in themselves or whether it's in someone else, they're looking for acceptance and approval. So yeah, that to me now it makes sense. What you said ties into it. That's where the appeal is for people that buy those kind of romances. They are yearning for that acceptance. And I thought, you know, as you were talking, I thought that girl that married herself, you know, that's kind of a brave thing to do. That's really, to me, like the ultimate self-acceptance. It's an outward symbol of it. I don't know. I don't know that I could do that.
It makes me think of one of my favorite movies is Mike White's The Year of the Dog, which is about this woman who has a series of kind of tries to dips her toe in the water of a series of relationships and ultimately chooses a life of animal rights activism and lots of dogs. And I used to teach it at the beginning of my gay and lesbian cinema class, and the students would be like, why are we watching this? There's no queer, like, we don't think of there being any queerness here. But the movie really challenges you to accept that this woman is making a happy life where her primary relationship is with the animal world instead. And it's a movie where all those rules about what it means to be happy really come up for you as a viewer, especially because it's cinema. So you're like, and now there's going to be a close-up and then another close-up, and it's like, no, now everyone's isolated in the frame. But I think it's not quite marrying yourself, but it's a great kind of movie that really works against our kind of like romantic plot assumptions.
Well, in a way, that's another version of a character that you sometimes see in lots of stories, but often love stories, is like the crazy cat lady. In fact, that's what we say, right? Like, end up in a relationship or you're gonna be the crazy cat lady, no friends, just 100 cats. And in lots of novels, there's the spinster who's off by herself, and she's usually sort of homely looking and very poor, or she's up and she's crazy in an attic. Like, there are versions of that character. They're usually used as like warnings, right? Don't be like that. But I'm curious about other kinds of characters in love stories. I got just some famous ones, so in Cyrano de Bergerac, there's like a person who's not attractive, and so has to sort of like play these games in order to like engage in this relationship. But it seems like usually though they're attractive, right? So like for every like version of Cyrano de Bergerac, there is like My Fair Lady, Taming of the Shrew, Beauty and the Beast is another Cyrano de Bergerac. My Fair Lady and like Taming of the Shrew, in which it's like about somebody becoming more attractive over the course of the story, either because they behave more attractively, as in Taming of the Shrew, and My Fair Lady, which is like they take somebody who's kind of, in many ways sort of doesn't dress right or whatever, and becomes more pleasing to the eye, more conventional. And I wonder if that's kind of essential to a love story. Is that something that you have to have or not? You're shaking your head.
Absolutely not. The book that was released in March, I've got a character that is horribly scarred all over her body. Her face, you can't see it, but her body bears scars. She came from a very abusive relationship. And so she is concerned. She has accepted that, I will never have love like other people have love. That's not what I'm going to do. So she builds a life for herself, saving girls, the daughters of prostitutes in London, England, in Georgian England. And so she has accepted that's going to be her life, and she's not looking for love. And the person that comes into her life is, again, somebody with a darkness inside of him, and he understands her world far better than she expects. First off, he comes in and he lies. He's not who he says he is. And then when she figures out who he really is, it turns out to be something that she connects with him on that level of darkness. She knows that he's seen some, I can't say the word here, but some bad stuff. And so it makes it to where, again, we're going back around full circle to where you have the perfect person for the perfect person. But I don't think that being physically unattractive, having a flaw, precludes someone from having romance. I don't think so at all. I think what it does is it makes people look beyond the physical and look more with their heart, more with their emotions, rather than just with the eyes. I don't think it stops a romance from happening. I don't want it to stop a romance from happening. Let me put it that way. I like those happy endings.
I would say that in popular culture, something I'm really interested in right now is the rise of the unlikable female character. You see it all over the place, and for me, it's really exciting. I crave it so much. I think in fiction, traditionally, there's a pattern of like in My Fair Lady, a bad woman who's either redeemed by the end of the story and becomes, the ideal woman, or punished. You've got your Cruella de Vil's who meet their untimely ends, and there's not much in between. So in my mind right now, it's a lot of television. You've got Claire Underwood and House of Cards. There's I Love Dick, which just came out, and it's this middle-aged woman who flips the male gaze, and it's this female gaze on Kevin Bacon, who she's just, obsessed with. But she's messy and monstrous, and it's sexy all at the same time. It's very complex. And then, Fleabag is another one on Amazon. And they're very, very messy women, but also they're pursuing relationship and connection and intimacy. And it just feels like a real missing part of our contemporary just literature. So I'm really excited, and I'm craving stories like that.
I was trying to look up the title. I can't find it, but I was wondering if you've read, and correct my mispronunciation of this writer's name, Otessa Moskve. Am I saying it?
I know who you're talking about. I think that's
Yeah, she's
all I
got
might
like
say
she's mixed parentage. I think she's like part Iranian and part Eastern European. I'm not sure where the last name comes. Anyway, what's that? Eileen's the novel, but she has a collection called Homesick for a Lost World. Is that it? But she has Homesick for Another World. I'm sorry. She has stories like that, and I agree that they're very satisfying. Like there's a very claustrophobic couple story about like an overachieving aspiring actor, and it's told from the point of view of his girlfriend who he lives with, and she just she can't stand him, and because it's so awesome, and because you can relate to her so well, that he's not being set up as a caricature or a buffoon. Like she just really doesn't like him, and he deserves her animosity. And I don't know. It was a very pleasurable story to read. It's a good book.
Paige, you look.
I write memoir, so whether people are pretty or not in my stories, I have limited control over. But I feel like protagonists with kind of huge character disorders are really interesting protagonists. And the book that comes to mind is Emma Perez's Forgetting the Alamo, which came out from UT Press a few years ago, I think there's a lot of contemporary love stories that also are about trauma, historical traumas or personal traumas, her character has this kind of vengeant bloodlust, which I'm usually not a huge fan of, although in this particular case of the colonization of Texas, it's appropriate. But I feel like it doesn't stop me at all from being invested in the love plot. The fact that this character is also, can fly off into these murderous rages.
Liana, I'm curious what you think about this idea of like unlikable, beyond so you've got these characters with scars, but then if you hold this book up,
I've been told that she's unlikable, and I had to actually tone her down a little bit for the editor because they said, oh, well, she needs to have some redeeming qualities. I'm like, okay, fine. Give her some redeeming qualities. She's not a complete Scarlett O'Hara. But I loved Scarlett O'Hara. You love to hate her. But at the end, you realize that she's strong, and you want her to triumph, even if it's by hook or crook. I like those kind of characters. I like flawed characters. I think if you write somebody that's too perfect, it just falls flat. Because people aren't perfect. And, imperfect people still find love. Otherwise, I wouldn't be married. I don't think any married person would be married. If they were perfect, it would be too much to live with, I think.
Do you think we'll ever see a romance novel without a beautiful person on the cover?
Because of the marketing done in the industry, I doubt it. I don't know. As far as a romance novel goes, they would put it in a niche is what they would do. They would call it a niche romance, and they would categorize it and put it in its little box. It wouldn't be put with all of the rest of them. And I think that's unfair in some ways. On the other side of it, the people at the publishing houses, they know what sells, and they're in it to make money. And so they're not going to do anything that's going to risk, the profits from whatever they're investing in. And it's a sad reality, I think. When you're looking at like a romance novel, they're not going to do that, because in romance novels, when the readers want to have that fantasy world. And I'll tell you, it was hard to write the book about the scarred woman. I really didn't think it was going to sell. I was surprised that it got as good a reaction as it did. I was nervous about it. I thought this could be the ruining of me, but I don't care. I have to write this book. I need to write her. And I'm glad I did, because I feel like it kind of tapped that ceiling and said, hey, we're getting ready to break through this. It doesn't all have to be pretty people. It just needs to be people. Love is universal, I think.
I think it's funny too. They are beautiful people, but they're also, I don't mean your book. I'm thinking more of like Fabio, but they're also kind of grotesque, It's like, who has a six-pack in 1840, right? Like, these guys were 4'8". They had rickets and probably syphilis. You know, they are not attractive people, you know? And so it's like, someone in my family, I don't want to put them on the spot because I do understand that people sometimes like do this pejoratively with romance novels, but someone in my family reads a lot of romance novels. And I was always like, cool. You know, I noticed that because in her home she has a million of them, and she just goes through them like logs on a buzz mill. And I was talking to her daughter. I was like, you know, it's so weird that your mom is pretty you know, conservative and religious and reads all these romance novels. What about the sexy parts, you know? And she goes, oh, she doesn't read those.
Oh, please.
And I'm like, really? She's like, no, seriously. Like, she skips over them because you know, she's not into that. And I was like, and that's kind of like when my point of view about romance as a genre kind of started opening up. I started flowering a little bit. So I was like, oh, okay, because I understand like zombie stuff and alien stuff. I kind of understand the subtext, but I didn't realize to what degree like that romance stood alone. Outside of the sexy bits, because like as a kid, that's the only part that I would read. Like, okay, here's Horace and Clarabelle, and like, all right, and then like, is there more? Oh, there's no more. What a rip.
So you were skipping the story.
Exactly.
She was skipping the sex.
Yeah, together, she and I are like one person, one reader. I legally couldn't.
So I wonder, one thing that you sometimes see in love stories, and we sometimes think about relationships this way, in the idea that we're fated to be with this person. And so I'm cheating a little bit because, Paige, I saw you sort of posing this question on Facebook, like, what book should I talk about? And I went and looked up one of them that you mentioned. And because I thought it was interesting, and it's a novel, Like Sun, by Felicia Luna Lemus. The jacket cover for that novel, the paragraph, ends like this. In the East Village of the mid-1990s, he meets the hauntingly familiar and magnetic Natalie. They fall in love and live happily ever after until, nearly 7 years later, on a clear September morning, the downtown skyline tumbles, and Frank finds himself smack in the middle of his predestined fate. The idea of predestiny and fate, obviously, like Shakespeare did a lot with it, and you hear people say this about relationships all the time. We were meant to be together. There's only one person for me. And that may or may not be true, but I think one could argue that might be unlikely. Why is that an attractive aspect of a love story? Or is that just like fun storytelling?
I think it might be good jacket copy. I don't know if the novel actually, it's more about someone's obsession with this photograph, but whether it's actually fate is a little open to interpretation. But I mean, I think it's a little bit like you were talking about freedom and like, would you rather be happy or would you rather be free? It's something we always all want to wrestle with in this way of like, is this my destiny? Is it not? Maybe that dovetails with, are there other fish in the sea? I don't know.
I mean, Clara, it sounds like the kind of like love story that you were writing was very much not like the opposite of that, in which there's one is not destined for one other person, and how boring that would be. Did you consciously write against that, or did that just sort of not enter like the frame of the story?
I don't know. This is another conflict for me because I had data to back up my connection. I had a 99% compatibility rating on OkCupid. So that gave me some confidence, like, okay, this person is potentially a really good match. And there were a lot of really magical things that happened when we met. So my logical side is like, no, that's bull or whatever. Oh, pardon my language. But then part of me was like, well, this is pretty magical and seems kind of unlikely, and weighing those two parts of myself. But then I also think just about romance and relationships throughout history. So many partnerships in the past were just about like pure function and families and economics, and the idea of one person being like the right fit for you would not have ever even entered your mind, right? It's all about the culture and context and time you live in. And romance, in the sense that we think of it now, like finding that perfect partner is kind of a new concept.
I think that, again, the rise of predestination, one person meant for another, finding your soulmate, I think that that's a very romantic notion. I don't think it's a practical notion. Scientifically, I just don't think that it holds water to think that there's only one person meant for another. people can feel that way. And when people see a couple that's been together for 50 years, they feel like, oh, they must have been meant to be together. And you can hear some of those crazy stories where, you know, these insane magical things happened to bring them together. And you're thinking, well, it has to be fate. It has to be some divine intervention that caused them to be brought together. I don't know that that's not the case, but evidence would build toward it not being the case. And I think, you know, for historical romance, you're right. Historically, you know, there were so many other reasons to be put together. Romance really didn't factor into it. The romance tends to happen after, you know, they've been put together at the altar. You said, you know, the first time you met was, you know, the day that you got married. Well, a lot of times that happened in historical romance. In history, in actual history, it happened all the time. But it didn't preclude that not, you know, blossoming into a romance. So, yeah, but I don't know about predestination. I just don't think that fate necessarily plays into it. I don't believe that.
I like to remind people that when Shakespeare wrote star-crossed lovers, that was a bad thing.
Yes.
That's synonymous with catastrophe, literally. That's what it means. It means you're ill-fated.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't mean that, yeah. I think any two people, like, you know, it's like insects, kind of, you know, I don't know. I think any two people within certain obvious parameters can theoretically hit it off. And like desert island scenario, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's up to you to save the the human race. And I think that Clara's story is kind of similar to that desert island scenario, because when you travel with someone, you don't, even though you're going out into the broad world in some sense, you know, linguistically, or, you know, you rely more so on this person. You know, do you think that's a fair?
Absolutely,
thing?
yeah.
We've mentioned endings. This is the last question, then I'll turn over to the audience. We've mentioned endings a little bit, mostly with sort of not happy endings, or depending on how you sort of phrase it, but like endings in which the love does not sort of like come to fruition, like they part. But I wonder how important, or what makes a satisfying ending to a love story. So obviously, like the ending to The Third Man and Casablanca, those are satisfying endings, even though they don't get together. But when we think of a satisfying ending to a love story, that's probably not the kind of ending we have in mind. In a romance novel, could you write a novel that ends with, and then they went their separate ways?
If you want your reader to fling the book at a wall and then fling it into a trash can, you can end it that way. If it's touted as a romance, it better have a happy ending, because the readers, they're counting on that. That's why they buy them, is because they want to experience that happy closure in some form or fashion. Reading is an escape. You know, it's a huge form of escapism. It's one of the reasons why I love to read. You know, it takes me out of the now and takes me somewhere else and into some other environment. So I don't know that you could get away with that in a quote unquote romance novel. If it's some other kind of fiction, yes, but not in a romance novel.
I wonder about, because we have two memoirs, I wonder about in memoir, can you think of memoirs that are about love that really did end up like with happily ever after? I mean, in Eat, Pray, Love, it kind of did, but then obviously like her subsequent books say no.
There's a local Austin comic book artist named Ben Snakepit. Some of you might know him. He's kind of a punk rock daily comic guy. I'm a big fan of his, and he has a memoir comic he did called Pills, which has a happy ending, and the happy ending is when his coworkers all chip in and pay for his divorce. And it is a very happy ending to a admittedly non-romantic dysfunctional relationship.
I can attest to that personally. Yes, celebrate some of those endings, yes.
My book has a happy ending. It does. You know, my love almost dies in the middle of it, but then it's also, I mean, I think a lot of books, a lot of romance, a lot of kind of literary romance is also coming of age. So there's that, maybe that self-acceptance that you were talking about, but there's like a love plot, but there's also a kind of coming into oneself plot that can be a happy ending as well.
That's a much better way of phrasing my poorly worded question, which is like what concept, when you're not sort of deriving like the happy ending from like, and then they live like sort of like they got together, which happens early in your book. Like, is it a kind of coming of age, like you've sort of learned something, or like you've come through something? What is there a device that functions as the ending in a different way? Did you struggle to find that, or?
Not for me, because I felt like the fact of writing the book was the sort of coming into myself as an artist. So the book very much ends with, and then I became a writer. And I don't think it's unusual. I mean, I think that kind of combination of coming of age and love story, or Bildungsroman, or portrait of the artist kind of story that's pretty common overlap in kind of, maybe it's modern, I don't know.
One of the things that we're taught when we write romance is you can't just have two people getting together and it be happily ever after. You have to have growth. Your characters, both of them, have to have growth. They have to be different than they were at the beginning of the story in order for it to be emotionally satisfying. So I think you're fighting on two fronts when you write a romance. You've got to have them getting together, if it's going to be called a romance, and then you've got to have them being changed. But it's not a forced change. They have to come upon it themselves. It's a journey of self-discovery. It is, for each character.
Claire, would you characterize your book that way, as a journey of self-discovery?
Yeah, definitely. That was kind of the closure for my book as well. It wasn't as much about my relationship, but it was more about what I had learned by embarking on this risky encounter with somebody else. And I purposely left the ending of my book vague, partly because I wanted to avoid that riding off into the sunset thing, and partly because I was genuinely unsure of where my relationship was going as I wrote the book. But, as we talked about earlier, people want that. They do. The number one question I get in interviews is, are you still together? Without fail. So yeah. But as a reader, I think the endings that I find most satisfying are the development of the main character, whether or not they end up with the person.
Ben, could you ever write a happy ending to a love story?
I just did. I think my first book's apparently going to come out next year. It's a little tiny thing. It's not a big deal, but it has a kind of, I was just thinking, it does kind of have a happy ending, sort of. Yeah, I don't know. Michael's read a couple of my stories.
I
published a novella with this wonderful imprint in Seattle, which you should all send your work to, called Big Fiction. They publish novellas in beautiful hand screen printed covers, letterpress pages. The paper is like creamy, wonderful linen paper. They're gorgeous. And the editor, her name is Heather Jacobs, is one of the smartest editors I've ever worked with. She reminds me of Tim O'Brien, who was my mentor in graduate school. That's how smart and precise she is. Somebody read that and wanted to develop it into a standalone fiction thing, and asked me to expand it. And I did, and it kind of has a happy ending if you bought my book, and you just tune out right now. But basically, the main character is taken in on a scam, simultaneously resisting this really implausible relationship that is being kind of propositioned to him by his coworker, but while also chasing this other woman he has no business chasing on multiple levels. And kind of like the ending is it's not an epiphany, but something bad and traumatic happens to him, and he survives and has a moment of reflection where he realizes that I'm actually pretty lucky to have the things that I resist. And so that's a moment. He leaves without his fingers being broken, which will make sense when you all read it. And so, yeah, it is a sort of happy ending. But it's a full course of the story starts out with him saying no to this person, and ends with him saying yes to her. And so that is the full revolution of the desire, resistance. And then that being said. And as I'm writing, I realized that this is the plot for a lot of YA fiction targeted to young women, where it's like, oh, the right one was standing in front of her the whole time, and I'm just like, great, that was my $20,000 MFA, and that's what I came up with, a high school novel cast with 50-year-olds.
The resistance is important, though. You're right. You have to have something to fight in it.
One of you said something earlier, and it reminded me I have this Rilke poem above my desk, and I'm going to paraphrase the first part of it. It says, "O you many unassaulted cities, have you never longed for the enemy?" And I just love that line. Yeah, it's kind of rapey. I get that part, but I do like the fact of wanting the thing that you are not supposed to want, or not wanting the thing that you are supposed to want. And as writers, it's kind of like the hidden contradiction that is like, that's the sweet fruit to find.
Any questions in the audience?
I was wondering, as a person that is gender non-binary, living in the middle of gender, my brain tends to think really gender binary when I'm listening to people talk for some reason. And so I'm thinking, what is the demographic of, is it women, what age that are reading the classic romance novel? And then I'm imagining our son saying recently, why would I date, he's just turned 14. Why would I date this young? It's not like I'm going to stay with the person I date forever. And, and remembering being a girl growing up and faking often, or thinking I need to be boy crazy and chase the boys, and, and from a really young age, and seeing the girls are boy crazy and the boys are like not having it, and seeing the different responses, genderly speaking, today on the panel, in relationship to love and romance and everything. I'm just curious about what your insights are about how gender informs the reader and what you write.
I know that for historical romance and for a lot of the romance genre, women do tend to dominate as the consumer for that. However, things are beginning to shift. It's just at the very nascent beginnings. I mean, I know a man who writes beautiful regencies, and it's something that is, people are always a little shocked when they hear that. And I'm thinking, why does it have to be, and my generation, we started thinking, why does it have to be gender assigned? Love is love. Anybody can write about love and do it beautifully. I think that things are starting to shift. Maybe it's just, again, at the very beginnings of it, but I see it beginning to happen in my own chapter and at RWA. I know for sure. We had a man that was nominated for a Rita last year, which is our Academy Awards, for his romance. And so it's refreshing to see it, and I think it's good. Again, though, for the time being, though, it is more of a female-dominated as far as consumers and as far as writers of romance.
And what age would you say?
Oh, gosh. Well, in looking at it, because this was something, and this is year-old data, of course, we looked at a presentation that showed that the majority of women were above the age of 30 that purchased these, all the way up into their 80s and 90s, some of them, but the majority between 30 and 50. However, there is a younger demographic coming out that's purchasing these romances, so we're capturing the 18-year-olds and the 19-year-olds, and I think that's wonderful. I started reading them at 14.
I guess I was wondering if the older person is thinking, yes, this is how it should have been, and the younger person's thinking, idealistically, this is what I want, I need this happy ending because I didn't get it. That's what I'm imagining.
We have a member, Evelyn Palfrey, who writes romances for seniors, and she calls them for the marvelously mature. So, and they're having some pretty fun times in those books. So I think it's all age. It's the #1 selling category in the world. So that's not just ladies buying that, and that's not just a certain age group. So are there any other questions?
Do you think someone who's never been in a romantic relationship can write about it believably?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that the elements that you need to write that persuasively and realistically are already within your possession. Even if you, I think that personal experience and mastery over a topic are helpful if you choose to write that way, but they're not, experience is highly overrated, is what I'm getting at.
Romance is about longing. Yeah. Ultimately, it's about longing and satisfying that longing. So if you've ever yearned for something, then you have what it takes. Years and years ago, and I cannot remember her name, there was an interview on television that I watched about a woman that had written all these top #1 hit romantic love songs, and she had never been in a romantic relationship. She was completely just a non-sexual person, but she wrote these songs with such convincing lyrics. I mean, oh my God, they're crying in the aisles listening to these songs. And I thought to myself, how can she do that? How can she speak so convincingly about something that she's never experienced? Well, again, if you know if you know the pieces of it, and you've ever experienced longing, I think of any kind, longing for a piece of cheesecake, you know what longing is, then you can write a romance, I believe. You may want to get some resources and check up on some things, to get the technical parts of it right, tab A and dislot B. But, I think that it can be done.
That's the IKEA version.
That's the IKEA version, yes.
You need it requires that little, that doesn't work. It's a visual joke. The Allen wrench. I think maybe a tactical, I was hoping that we could talk about craft a little bit before we run out of time too. And I think a tactical approach that will be a good friend to anyone who's writing about something outside of their personal sphere of experience is to not explain. Just remember that your reader, there's a good chance she's smarter than you. And there's a good chance that, and if she's older than you, she's probably more experienced anyway. It doesn't really matter what your experience is. If you're writing to everyone, you're writing to her as well. And so don't explain, because your reader, she's doing probably most of the cognitive work that is required to make your fiction or nonfiction real in her mind. Like you can write the word red, but she's the one who has to make red.
Yeah, starships don't exist yet, but I write them, and it's not within my experience, so.
So I was a very avid romance novel reader when I was in middle school and high school, and just, every now and then now. And I still remember the 400-page romance novel that I read where the character at the very end died, and the last line was, "His cup runneth over." Seriously, I read that maybe 20 years ago, and I still remember it because I was so heartbroken after reading 400 pages that they didn't get together.
Was that Mary Renault, The Last of the Wine, the historical romance?
Oh my God, it might be. But I read recently that Harlequin romance novel is rumored to be ending like 5 other titles. I feel I don't think that there's a reduction in interest, but maybe it shifted in the type of romance. So it kind of brings to question the idea of, is there room for diversity, or publishing companies just not kind of going for those types of novels?
I think that diversity is something that they are seeking to expand. Harlequin's closing down certain lines is going to be done for the bottom line. Yeah. If it happens, the things that go on inside of the publishing houses, it's because of sales. It's all driven by sales. But the saying, when a door closes, a window opens. If you see it happening in one publishing house where they're closing out lines, you'll see it in another publishing house where they're opening those up, because there's still a demand for it. If people are going to buy it, there will be a place for it at those publishing houses. I don't know the reasons why certain houses close down certain lines. Because I'm not an insider with that, I have to assume that it's all driven by sales and by the bottom line.
Also, I believe Harlequin was purchased by HarperCollins recently. Yep. So I think that my guess would be that they're kind of contracting before they expand again, because they're under new ownership.
Right.
I think we had one more question up here.
So I have a memoir that I've sort of started, starts and stops over the years, and it takes place, a couple years ago, and it's the travel type of thing, and then Elizabeth Gilbert came out with hers, and I was like, no, I should have done it first. But so to Paige and Clara, when you guys wrote these memoirs that are based on real people in your life, how do you do that without pissing people off? Because, I have a whole host of characters that are both evil and good and multifaceted, and they are real people that I know, in-laws and my relatives. How do you maneuver that? I had one self-publisher tell me that I could just say that it was loosely based on real life, but it's going to be pretty close. How do you maneuver real life with these books and with people you love and not distancing yourself?
I had kind of a mixed approach. So for everyone who I felt, basically for everyone except my parents, who's represented in the book, I let them read my representation of them and give them a chance to give me some feedback. With my parents, I felt like the power relationship was a little bit different, and rather than me feeling like I had all the power in the situation, I felt like, well, they're still my parents, I'm not going to give them that power. So for me, that was part of kind of what I felt like was my, to a certain extent, kind of an ethical obligation. But I was also super lucky because my in-laws are huge storytellers, and they're all quite aware of their faults and exploit their comic potential, like Katie's whole family, quite often. And so I felt like there was like no tale I could tell on them that they hadn't told on themselves already.
I think I was lucky in some cases too, because my partner at the very beginning of the process, you know, we'd only known each other 5 or 6 months when I came to him and I said, look, I just had this offer to tell our story to the whole world, and how do you feel about that? And he told me, he said, you can write whatever you want about me, and I'm not gonna get in the way, and even if it reflects poorly on who I am, it's okay, you can just do it. And I was skeptical. I'm like, yeah, you say that now. But to his credit, he really stuck to it. He read all my drafts, and he never, ever suggested that I tone it down or make him seem anything other than what I had portrayed him as. But as Paige said, I think there is an ethical element, and it's something that memoirists constantly discuss about what is that fine line between sort of speaking your truth and then also, you know, being fair in what you reveal about people's personal lives. And it really is contextual, and it requires just, I think, a lot of thoughtfulness. And I think sometimes having people read is sometimes an option, and sometimes it's not.
Please give our panelists a warm round of applause.
This has been the Writers League of Texas podcast. For more information about the Writers League of Texas and our many programs and services for writers, visit our website at writersleague.org. Email us at wlt@writersleague.org or give us a call at 512-499-8914. Thank you for listening.